didn't expect the clapping. That was so nice. Thank you, Dr. Evans, for asking me to speak today on a topic that is just so intellectually and personally meaningful. When Dr. Evans proposed this lecture and its date, we understood that it must speak in some way to the outcome of the 2024 presidential election. We could not have anticipated, though, the unexpected turn of events that followed President Joe Biden's withdrawal from the campaign and the subsequent nomination of Vice President Kamala Harris, right? It was a surprise, wasn't it? Like, it just did not follow any of our scripts. So the campaign consequently became a contest between two historically unprecedented candidates. In an already polarized political climate, the campaign's outcome was just impossible to predict. Any poll watchers? Was anybody checking, like on the hour, to see if there had been any movement or not, right? We had no idea. With partisan identities conflated with competing visions of the country's meaning, purpose, and future, the candidates struggled to build majority coalitions by vying, often vitriolically, for voters located on the partisan margins. In the weeks, years, and even decades to come, we will have much to unpack about the historical context that shaped the conduct of the campaign, its proposed causes and effects, and the inevitable historical counterfactuals about what might have been possible or what could have been avoided. More immediately, as Dr. Evans just said, you might be grappling, as many are, with some pretty strong emotions about the election's outcome, ranging from elation to despair. As a mother, friend, neighbor, teacher, and colleague, that speaks to our topic today because we've got lots of identities going on, all of us. I have similarly spent the week engaged in a kind of intellectual and emotional triage. Does anybody else have that experience? Kind of talking about it incessantly, what happened, what's going on, and how could we not, right? Widely felt anxieties evoked by the unmet expectations for security and liberty animated this election. These fears took the form of dissatisfaction and anger with incumbents, but they were also weaponized and amplified, our fears were, to generate electoral support for candidates who offered very, very different explanations for our fears and the promises for using the state to allay them. Now, the outcome of this unprecedented election portends a future that feels even more unpredictable and uncertain for at least half of the country who are disappointed with its outcome. In reflecting on the 2024 presidential election and discerning its lessons, we are engaged in a democratic practice that is inseparable from our civic obligation to vote. We are here today to enact an important component of the liberty we claim as U.S. citizens, the right of informed consent. And I am building exactly on what Dr. Evans talked about last week because I know that you really underscored the importance of consent. So in addition to voting, consent encompasses an obligatory process of information gathering, analyzing, deliberating, reflecting, and discerning. And these activities must inform the exercise of consent and the democratic selection of elected officials who will enact the laws that govern our civil society and harmonize, hopefully, the interests of the individuals who are theoretically the same because we are all declared to be equally free. But at the same time, we are very, very different from each other. Can you see where I'm going here? About that contradiction that I just talked about? You are equal under the rule of law, which implies that you're the same, but there is no one in this room who is the same. And so somehow we have to use our rule of law to reconcile those differences so that we can get along with each other in civil society. And the only tool we have to do that is democracy, constitutionally. So ideally then, we're going to get here together today, and I know Dr. Evans, last week you said that we are not here to pick up our degrees, we are here to educate ourselves in relationship to each other so that we can develop the knowledge and skill that enhance our capacity for consent and thus our ability to get always better at democracy. We're going to be here together today to figure out if we can become more effective at expressing our liberties in relationship to the other rightful individuals who inhabit civil society with us. This exercise is necessary for informed consent, and this is a quote, is the cornerstone of the liberal political project because the expression of one's will confirms and inaugurates belonging within the citizenry of reasonable humans. And if I can get this to work, okay? Let's end. Oh, it worked. Consent. Now this is a quote from John Locke, and the one that I just read for you is Emily Owens. But through consent, free individuals. So through consent, free individuals voluntarily relinquish a portion of their liberty to join a civil society, the people. And, let me see, I have my thing up here. Oh, nope, sorry. There we go, the people slide. Okay, so we voluntarily relinquish our liberties in order to join a civil society, the people, that governed by a democratically established rule of law, enhances the ability of its members to enjoy their endowed freedoms more securely and completely. Informed consent is not only a huge civil responsibility, but given the current calcification of our partisan divisions and the circulation of misinformation through different political technologies, our right to consent is ever more essential. So in our time together today, what I hope we can do is to begin thinking about ways that we can get out of this current state of political polarization. And what I'm going to suggest to you is one of its principal causes: the identification with diametrically opposing partisan identities. We become members of political parties and think of ourselves as Democrats and Republicans. Remaining entrenched in a fearful and defensive stalemate like this undermines our fundamental right of consent, rendering us incapable of fully enjoying our rights or fulfilling our obligations as citizens of this liberal democratic republic. So I'm going to do a little historical framing here because that's what historians do. You're my captive audience. When I say, well, according to history with my kids, they run completely. Here you are, and you can't leave. So the property white male delegates who convened the 1787 Constitutional Convention celebrated the liberating relationship between personal and political self-governance, but they also had ample evidence that men were hardly angels, to quote James Madison. They consequently understood that the Republican experiment in self-governance depended upon a shared loyalty to liberal axioms or rules, a civically virtuous commitment to aligning individual and collective goals, the exercise of reason and moral restraint, and the diffusion of political authority in a federated and divided system of governing a large republic to stave off the threat of factionalism. Fears of corruption and tyranny nevertheless persisted, and these escalated as the new nation became more economically, demographically, and religiously diverse and complex. In the context of this continuous process of modernization, Americans have sought to prevent liberty's disaggregating effects, individualizing connotations, and competitive impulses from destroying a republic embodied in the phrase, "we the people." Enshrined in the preamble of the Constitution, the people is really a collectivizing abstraction created by those who consensually participate in civil society to protect the possession of their liberties. The tension between the declarations of individual liberty and collective identity have created numerous conundrums for successive generations of U.S. citizens. First, how might free citizens pursue individual interests and liberties without undermining the common good? And Dr. Evans, I know you talked about that last week as well, this tension between our individual liberties and what our responsibilities are to the nation and to each other. Similarly, is it possible to avoid the conflict arising from the competing pursuits of individual liberty or the unequal effects of liberty's expression? In other words, how do we all get along? Finally, can these contradictions between individuals and between the individual and the collective of the nation be resolved through a democratic process and procedures and the institutions that function to secure an equally protective rule of law? Perhaps, right? But only if free citizens accept the imperative of self-regulation that ensures democratic processes have Republican or virtually balanced outcomes. And when I say Republican here, you all know that I'm not talking about big R Republicans, members of the Republican Party. I'm talking about the civic obligation as members of a republic. If I can get this up here. So fostering this modernization, necessary for harmonizing competing expressions of individual liberty, has led to many creative solutions. Most of these have involved interrelated conceptions of race and gender and sexuality, and the bodies socially assigned to these categories of identity. Since the early republic, for example, white women have been delegated a civil role of moral guardianship, performed through idealized depictions of maternal labor and selfless service to family, church, and community. I don't know if you can see this or not up here, but the mother sways the dominion of the heart, the father that of the intellect. And I love it how your mom is sitting here in the comfort of their home, focused on the children. Dad's pointing out, to the moon, son, that's yours, look outside beyond the home. But her ministrations are what's essential for sort of preparing him for that. And then it's also ensuring that when he goes out into the world of work and politics, that he is also taking a capacity for moral self-regulation. So these guardians of hearth and home invoked their domestic expertise and responsibilities in the late 19th and early 20th century to create new public and political roles for white women. During this period of rapid and unregulated industrialization, the divergence between white male workers' declared political rights and the economic reality of their lives in an unregulated industrial system became really very apparent, inciting ideological critiques and collective protests that were often suppressed with violent force. The experience of industrial exploitation made it clear that workers' political rights failed to entitle ethnically diverse, but people who were becoming categorically white male workers to own the means of production or to claim a greater share of industrial profits. In response to workers' possible revolts, progressive reformers, a group that included women, Dr. Evans writes about these women and part of their work for suffrage, devised a new role for government, using government's constitutional authority to enact and enforce laws that regulated bad corporations, that was kind of Theodore Roosevelt's distinction between bad and good corporations, restored white male workers' dignity in the workplace, secured their opportunities in the national economy, and preserved their economic supremacy in their households as breadwinners. By the end of the 1930s, the federal government had presumably landed on this strategy for reconciling investors' freedom to profit with workers' political rights and economic needs, putting an end, supposedly, to the upheavals of the previous decades. With ideological consensus and socioeconomic harmony seemingly renewed in the aftermath of World War II, America's democratic republic, symbolized by the beautiful home, seemed back on track to manifest its destiny of inevitable progress. So, what happened to the sense of optimism and unlimited possibility? Pollsters in 2024 reported voters' dissatisfaction with the state of the country and their economic prospects. That's what we heard, right? The country is not on the right track and it's got to be rectified in some way. And much is now being said and written to explain voters' frustrated post-pandemic demand for change and their consequent rejection of incumbency, not only in the United States, but also around the world and among its peer nations. But I want to focus on one of these arguments offered by an historian named Heather Cox Richardson. Has anyone ever encountered Heather Cox Richardson before? It's a daily newsletter at Boston College. But Heather Cox Richardson has made this argument that, and she's really distilled it very clearly, that the legislative victories of the civil rights and the feminist movements in the 1960s and early 1970s coincided with pretty significant upheavals. One was the neoliberal response to increasing global economic competition that began in the 1970s. And the other was the debacle of the Vietnam War that really eroded public trust in our governing institutions and also in the media to some extent. These worked in combination to delegitimize what is called the liberal consensus. And this liberal consensus had sustained widespread voter support for the New Deal. While hardly perfect or fully inclusive, liberal, like big state governance, used a combination of regulation, investment, and limited assistance to ameliorate the contradiction between American workers' declared rights and their economic realities. These policies supported socioeconomic mobility of working-class white Americans, sustaining a meritocratic myth, you can get ahead if you try, in the inseparable rights of economic and political self-determination. Since the 1980s, however, Richardson goes on, neoliberal policies enacted by both Republican and Democratic parties have stalled and even reversed these state-supported gains for U.S. workers. These policies have exacerbated the economic impacts of global competition, globalization, mergers, and mechanization on wages, particularly those earned by working-class white men. As a reflection of all of these trends, the 2024 presidential election illustrates how since the 1980s, partisan politics has devolved into a type of trench warfare over competing theories of liberal capitalism and the state levers required to reproduce the political economy, and the social relations and narratives that we tell in order to reinforce the perceived legitimacy of the political economy. For example, one side of the debate has argued that the deregulation of markets, consolidation of capital, reduction of federal spending, and consequent privatization of the economy's reproductive costs. And what are reproductive costs? The kind of unpaid work that goes in here. Okay, more effectively yield opportunity-generating economic growth and a more natural equilibrium between wages and prices. The brilliance, okay, and it kind of was, of the Trump campaign was to take these neoliberal policies and to make them consistent with the kind of working class populism as well as a religious fundamentalism. Harris's campaign, in contrast, even though it was about turning the page, actually more explicitly promised to maintain a neoliberal status quo. We are not going to do anything to change what is working well. Instead, put up some regulatory guardrails and expand investment to offset the effects of neoliberal policies and their logics on workers, particularly women. So cultural and religious disagreements over the expression of personal liberty are inseparable from these ideological debates about the government's role in reconciling diverse citizens' political and economic rights and opportunities. The culture wars, everybody's heard that term before, right? Effectively mobilized partisan support and facilitated party identifications. Yet as important for our examination today, these culture wars also distracted voters from the failure of both Republicans and Democrats to offer a clear and forward-looking vision of an individually free and socially just society. And this is a future that will move the country forward beyond the current partisan impasse. In other words, we were still stuck, right? We're just stuck here at the intersection with only the choice to stay where we are, using the state to remediate the effects of systemic inequality, or to use the state to reimpose social roles and relationships that prior to the civil rights movement and the feminist movements facilitated the accumulation of capital for investors while also creating an illusion of politically protected rights and meritocratic opportunity for male breadwinners. The post-election commentary of sociologist Tressie McMillan Cottom has informed this critique of the partisan failure to offer a hopeful alternative. What would this alternative be? Before we can even begin to identify and enact a new future vision of for the country, Cottom argues that we must question our assumptions about the connection between social and partisan identities. A simplified understanding of identity politics, this connection between social and partisan identity, that this more simplified understanding of identity politics suggests that members of marginalized or more minoritized groups share a unifying sense of identity based on a common experience of oppression or discrimination that determines their electoral decisions. Dictated by identity politics, voting becomes a homogenizing and predictable reaction to experience. And you have just experienced an election. How many times did you hear predictions about black voters are going to do this, white voters are going to do this, or women are going to do this? Does that sound familiar in the way? That's identity politics, right? One of the things that Cottom does is she joins other scholars and she says that the linkage between racial minoritization, especially, and party affiliation is inherently racist. But you know what's also racist, she says, is eliding the fact that white Americans also have an identity politics, that they have an identity that shapes their electoral decisions. Everybody engages in identity politics. So, as Cottom explains, and this is her quote, American politics is identity politics. It is a battle for the identities that will be named and shamed while others are granted anonymity and power. Cottom views the Harris campaign's appeal to undecided independents and moderate Republicans, particularly white suburban women, as well as the Republican Party's surging popularity among rural, working class, and non-educated voters as an unspoken white identitarian politics, which enacted through gender tropes and performances of power also appealed to some marginalized men of color. So what I mean here is that when we talk about inflation, are we only talking about inflation? Or are we talking about a scarcity of resources and the desire to regain access to those resources? So we always have to look beyond the offered explanation to see if we can critically analyze if the explanation is actually what describes the situation. So if we learn anything from Harris's loss, Cottom concludes, it should be that we must stop sacrificing the power of other identities, their values, their hopes, their security for a chance that will not pan out. Whose identities does Cottom think was being sacrificed by the Democratic Party? Those of the country's black and brown women who almost universally supported Harris's candidacy. In calling for a political vision that refuses to pander to the experiences and needs of white voters or men of color on both sides of the partisan aisle, Cottom represents a long history of African American feminist activists and intellectuals who have spoken truth to the sources of power that have historically marginalized black and brown women. To illuminate this truth, they have articulated a paradigm called intersectionality. So in the time I have remaining today, I want to explain what this paradigm of intersectionality actually is and how it can offer a framework for using democracy to progress beyond the intersections, this debilitating and demoralizing impasse created by identity politics. Simply stated, intersectionality is a framing that makes the specific experiences of black and brown women visible within the analytical paradigms, social justice movements, histories, and public policies that have either erased or misrepresented them. So for an example of that is that if I ask you to name a woman who was a member of the civil rights movement, who would most people say, do you think?
Rosa Parks.
Rosa Parks, right? And then who?
Diane Nash.
Diane Nash, right? And then
Harriet
who?
Tubman.
Harriet Tubman. We think about, he's an early civil rights activist. Who else?
Ida B. Wells.
Ida B. Wells, another early civil rights activist. And we're talking about a long civil rights movement here, and that's really important. And so the thing is that because of the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of black women who participated in civil rights activism, we should not have to, for one moment, stop and think about it. We should just be able to rip those names off. And that is one of the points that intersectionality makes clear. So legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw coined the term intersectionality in 1989. And you can Google Crenshaw's TED Talk if you were in my Women and Gender Studies class, you watched it. And so what Crenshaw was finding is that she's a lawyer and she was representing a group of African American women who were suing their employer for discrimination. And the employer said, I am not discriminating because I hire white women and I hire black men. But what Crenshaw found then is that there really wasn't a way to legally challenge the fact that black women continued to remain marginalized within the company's hiring practices. And so intersectionality then creates a way of seeing, saying, and then also doing something about the specific forms of oppression, marginalization, and violence that have characterized black women's experiences of paid and unpaid labor in both public and private settings. So Crenshaw's legal critique of federal civil rights legislation and its application fall within another long history of black women's efforts to explain and mobilize against the experience of sexism and racism. Explaining how these systems of domination operate simultaneously, black feminists have pointed to the co-construction of race, gender, class, and sexuality as these categories have functioned to divide diverse peoples into homogenizing identities that are positioned within hierarchical relations of power. Conceptualized within economic, political, and social systems, these categories of identity have served to support, naturalize, and resist exploitative forms of capital accumulation. So let's break this down a little bit historically. So because intersectionality is going to be rooted in, it's going to be rooted in the history of slavery. So in England's North American colonies, legalized enslavement and its justifications produced concepts of race and racial domination that also shaped and were shaped by how English Anglo-American colonists really thought the ideal relationship and responsibilities between men and women should be divided. So the legal inability of enslaved African descended colonists to replicate this ideal relationship between men and women was enforced through the regulation of Euro-American women's sexuality, and then also the sexual violations permitted by the commodification of African Americans' women's reproductive capacity. So I got this up here, parta sequitur ventrum, and so this is going to be a law from 1662, and you can read part of the text of the law here. And this is essentially the law of maternal inheritance that is going to place black women's labor entirely within the economy, depriving them of any ability to claim the privatized protections of living in a patriarchal family or to maintain custody over their own children as a kind of private relationship that is protected within the boundaries of family life. And so this is, of course, going to make slavery something that becomes perpetual and inheritable. But then if we look at how is this also maintained, it's also going to be maintained by regulating white women's sexuality. And so when we see this 1691 law and we read this law critically, we see that this law was passed by the Virginia Assembly, the House of Burgesses, in order to banish any woman, and particularly women, although men also applied, who were going to have a relationship, an intimate relationship with an African-descended man. And then if there were children that were born out of this relationship, those children would be forced into a condition of indentured servitude for most of their lives. Now you're saying 30 years, you think that's a half of life. If you lived in colonial Virginia in the 17th century, you were lucky to get to the age of 30. And so what this essentially does is it imposes a racial binary on these North American colonies because Virginia becomes a template for all the other colonies. And what happens as a result of this regulation of women's sexuality, the commodification of black women's reproductive capacity, is that it creates this division between who is white and who is black. And so very diverse African-descended peoples who are forced to labor in the colonies and an equally diverse group of Euro-Americans who are coming to the colonies for a variety of reasons are going to be legally positioned into categories based on what becomes their race. And race is actually a relationship to property and legal protection, so that people who were African descended and enslaved were not able to claim any protections before the courts. They could also not claim any property that would support their independence or any custody rights over their children. So race is this legal construct that is created to facilitate the accumulation of capital for some people at the expense of others. And this becomes foundational to a kind of racialized logic of domination that was embedded within the way that the colonial economy operated. Okay, so this is really, really important to know, because it is going to essentially persist in the afterlife of slavery and through other different kinds of legal innovations, okay? So we have to get here and sort of weave white women back into the story, because one of the things that black women are going to do is that free and enslaved women are going to do everything possible to liberate themselves and to participate in, to initiate an abolitionist movement. They will make moral claims about the immorality of slavery that will be very persuasive to people, white people living in northern states, particularly after the evangelical revolution of the early 19th century. And what they're going to do is white women are going to get actively involved in this abolitionist movement started by black women. But then what's going to happen is that they are going to find themselves marginalized by the white men who come to dominate the abolitionist movement. Now, this is going to lead someone like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott to call a convention for women's rights and argue that if women who are really advocating against the oppression of black people are finding themselves similarly oppressed in their own marriages, then they need to be able to have economic and political liberties. But despite this connection between the abolitionist movement initiated by black women and the women's rights movement that is going to grow out of the abolitionist movement, the first women's rights convention in Seneca Falls, New York is not going to include black women. So this is going to lead Sojourner Truth. Has anybody encountered Sojourner Truth before or heard this famous speech? This is going to lead Sojourner Truth to issue the rhetorical, albeit inaccurately recorded question, "Aren't I a woman?" Speaking to the double jeopardy, the violences and vulnerabilities that black women uniquely experienced, Truth claimed for herself the strength of any man, as well as the love and loss of a mother. Truth then assured that the rights for all women need not come at men's expense. Now notice here, she's got to work within this logic of domination created by the racial binary, that white freedom is defined in opposition to black enslavement. She's like, that's, or white male power is defined in opposition to their ability to have legal dominion over their households and their wives and their juvenile dependents. But so she says that the women are coming up, blessed by God, and a few of the men are coming up with them. But man is in a tight place. The poor slave is on him, the women are coming on him, and he is surely between a hawk and a buzzard. I think that's a way of saying between a rock and a hard place, okay? Another impasse. But post-bellum civil rights and feminist activists continue to call attention to the functions and effects that black women suffered standing in a densely trafficked intersection of race, class, gender, and sexuality. As early as 1866, abolitionist and published author Frances Ellen Watkins Harper issued this critique to the white attendees of the National Women's Rights Convention. And this is her quote: "You white women speak here of rights, I speak of wrongs. Only by addressing these injustices," Harper argued, "will American society have no privileged class trampling upon the unprivileged classes, but will be then one great privileged nation whose privilege will be to produce the loftiest manhood and womanhood that humanity can attain." She is talking here about the moral pursuit of happiness and calling out that the oppression of groups of people ultimately stymies the ability to make progress, the nation's ability to make progress toward what it is imagined to be. Harper distinguished this conscionable expression of consent from either indifferently supporting the dominant party or voting dictated by prejudice or malice. So she likened the latter, prejudice and malice, to the leadership of President Andrew Johnson. Now, I just had to throw this quote in here. I don't know if there are any historians, but people really like to sort of give a bad Andrew Johnson quote whenever we possibly can. Isn't that true, right? Okay, so she says, Andrew Johnson, who throws himself, and she calls him the incarnation of meanness, across the pathway of the nation by forsaking not only the freedmen and women of the South, but also poor whites. Society cannot afford to neglect the enlightenment of any class of its members, Harper warned, for, and this is her quote, "We are all bound up together in one great bundle of humanity, and society cannot trample on the weakest and feeblest of its members without receiving the curse in its own soul." So in calling for a colorblind nation, Harper called out not the observable fact of her racial difference, but from the perspective of her racialized experience, the discriminatory functions and effects of racial categorization. A race that could never describe who she knew herself to be. Harper's critique was also a call to action that connects democratic rights and practices with democratic intentions, commitments, and outcomes. So Mary Church Terrell, she's an educator and a club woman, someone who's organized and working for civic causes, continued to stress black women's intersectional experiences, perspectives, and limitations at the 1890 convention of the National Woman Suffrage Association. There, Terrell pronounced, "A white woman has only one handicap to overcome, a great one, true, her sex. An African-American woman faces two, her sex and her race. An African-American man has only one, that of race." Terrell's observation made evident that black women enjoyed the representation of neither the civil rights movement nor the women's rights movement. Instead, they were urged to remain silent in the service of supporting black men's claims to the signifiers of gender and class power and of avoiding white supremacist objections to the radical implications of recognizing women's political and economic rights. Black women nevertheless refused to remain silent. You mentioned Ida B. Wells, okay? Ida B. Wells integrated the 1913 women's suffrage procession against the orders of its radical organizer, Alice Paul. Even after the ratification of the 19th Amendment, black women continued to press their case to Paul and the members of the National Woman's Party. At the NWP's 1921 convention, they sought allies to defeat Jim Crow voting restrictions in the southern states, urging this first wave of feminist activists to remember, no women are free until all are free. For the next 50 years, black women contributed their energies, their talents, their labor to labor organizing, civil rights initiatives, feminist organizations, and grassroots activism, always waging a simultaneous battle against both racial and gender inequality. Pauli Murray coined the term Jane Crow to argue that Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 14th Amendment definitively prohibited both racial and gender discrimination. With fellow civil rights lawyer Mary Eastwood, Murray represented race and sex as entirely comparable classes, susceptible to implications of innate inferiority and open to those deep traditional implications which become attached to the classes regardless of the actual qualities of the members of the class. So what she's saying is these categories of identity are going to operate in discriminatory ways, and black women don't have any choice about how they are positioned into categories, nor do they have very much ability socially to define themselves in opposition to them because of these totalizing stereotypes associated with race and gender. So to oppose the homogenizing function and effects of racial and gender categorization, Murray and Eastwood asserted that laws must not only prevent, this is a quote, the unjust effect of the prejudice, but also lead to a general upholding of the dignity and equality, the legal status of the class. So Cottom's hope for a democratic vision accountable to black women's needs and interests reflects this nuanced distinction between negative and positive conceptions of liberty in Murray's legal argument. Citing the President's Commission on the Status of Women, of which both Murray and Eastwood were members, these lawyers vowed that the fundamental law of the land must enshrine the connection between women's rights, democracy, and democracy's, here it is, commitment to the ultimate value of the individual. A commitment to the value of the individual. Murray went on to become a co-founder of the National Organization for Women in 1966. When Murray's groundbreaking legal work proved far more influential in supporting white women's legal challenges to discrimination, Murray joined a chorus of black feminists who criticized NOW's middle-class white leaders for deviating from its initial commitment to racial and economic justice. And if any of you go and look at interviews, recorded interviews with Ruth Bader Ginsburg, she's very clear that her legal cases in the 60s and 70s were based on the legal brilliance of Pauli Murray. And so she really wants to underscore this, that here Murray is going to lead this movement, and instead she's going to go to Brandeis University, and she's going to become that university's first professor of African American and women's studies. And so, like a lot of other women, Murray is going to enter the academy, and in the academy attempt to find a place where her experiences can be critically analyzed and acted upon. So what we see here in this slide is the Combahee River Collective. And the Combahee River Collective are very much going to participate in what they call the cultural and experiential nature of our oppression, out of a necessity, because none of these matters has ever been looked at before. They are going to engage in this analytical process of understanding African American women's unique experiences. And even though, as they say, countless generations had been involved in this work before, it had never been sort of privileged within the academy as a topic of study. So formed in 1974, the Combahee River Collective was a radical black feminist organization that again sought to engage in this critical analysis and validation of African American women's particular experiences. They are the ones who coined the term identity politics. So similar to Pauli Murray's departure from now, the CRC was also an outgrowth of the National Black Feminist Organization. And they wanted an organizational and intellectual home for black feminists, lesbian, socialists, not only to redress the limited theoretical understanding of black women's experiences, but also to pursue democratic remedies that rectified the causes and consequences of the systemic inequalities that African American women felt the double burden of. So as the CRC's mission statement proclaimed, our politics initially sprang from the shared belief that black women are inherently valuable, that our liberation is a necessity, not an adjunct to somebody else's, but because of our need as human persons for autonomy. Now here we're coming back to consent right here, because your right to consent originates in your autonomy. And so this is the concern. So how can African American women understand intersectionality and engage in identity politics in order to create a location of autonomy through which they can engage in a democratic process more consensually? So you mentioned Harriet Tubman. The Combahee River Collective took its name from Harriet Tubman's daring raid on the Combahee River in South Carolina in 1873. The CRC similarly endeavored to liberate women of color from overlapping and interlocking systems of racial, sexual, and class oppression. So when we see here, though, that like the historical figures whose legacy they honored, the CRC also challenged the ingrained imperialist and mercantile conception of freedom as a zero-sum game. Echoing the black suffragists of 1921, the 1970 CRC statement stipulated, if black women were free, it would mean that everyone else would have to be free, since our freedom would necessitate the destruction of all systems of oppression. So this is going to become a refrain that we see, that if black women were free, everyone would be free. Because if black women were free, there would be no more oppression in society. There would be complete liberation. So how do we understand this repetition? And we have to historicize this. So since the abolition of slavery in 1865, black Americans have battled the white supremacist insistence that equality for black Americans inevitably represents a loss of liberty for white Americans. So 100 years later, and in the aftermath of the civil rights movement's legislative victories, the partisan politics of the 1970s forced the CRC to respond once again to the racial limits of liberal universalism and to try to eradicate or to separate the meaning of freedom from a long history of domination in which white rights and opportunities were achieved at the expense of African American rights and opportunities. So similar to Richard Nixon's appeal to the silent majority, fears of lost security animated this year's presidential election. Both Democrats and Republicans framed their partisan competition as a battle for survival in a foreboding and lawless state of nature characterized by the opposing parties' undemocratic attempts to maintain control over political authority, economic resources, and moral liberties. Was the Republican candidate a threat to our democratic institutions and personal freedoms? Did the Democratic candidate empower internal and external enemies of a free nation requiring a decisive and repressive response that could be effectively enacted only by a muscular political leader and his loyalists? The answers to these questions hinge on how voters identified with irreconcilably opposed partisan identities that I'm going to suggest to you were also inherently racialized. Voters made a choice, but did they actually consent? This is the question. When you are engaged in an election where you are fearful that someone is going to take something away from you because we are locked into the logic of domination, can we truly consent to the laws that govern us? So as the nation's ideological and constitutional architects understood it, consent is impossible to exercise in the absence of intellectual and economic autonomy. People who are rational, people who have access to the means of production, they assumed were not inherently fearful. And this is one of the reasons why women couldn't vote, right? Does anybody remember that famous exchange between John Adams and his wife Abigail? Like right before the signing of the Declaration of Independence, she writes in that letter and she says, "Hey John, I hear that you're talking about this extraordinary code of laws. Please remember the ladies." Does anybody remember what he says? "Abigail, don't be so," are you ready? "Saucy." That's what he told her. He's like, everybody knows that women are in charge. Don't worry, you'll still be in charge of the household, but I'll take care of everything else for you. She wasn't convinced, okay? But explaining the exclusion of white women and free black citizens, free blacks from civil rights and protections of citizenship, scholar Emily Owens explains, even as consent secured the freedom of the few Americans counted within the polity, it also functioned as a tool to justify and maintain the unfreedom of everyone else. And so again, this is what John Adams is saying, is that women are not economically independent and therefore they can't consent. And so the same would be true of free blacks because of discrimination, and then because of racism, were also viewed as being incapable of intellectually or economically having the capacities to consent to the laws that govern them as full members of civil society. So reason and property, the antidotes of fear, does enable the leaders of the new republic to qualify or reject the rights of anyone who failed to possess consent's prerequisites. So black feminists, whose ancestors had once been property, have called attention to the historical violences and violations that the right of consent has historically permitted. In the process, they have articulated a revolutionary means of reviving democracy's significance for the protection of liberal rights and reviving the attainment of its ideals. So their reason in intellect, so we're thinking about this, right? That African American women are working in the academy, and they're using their reason and intellect to fully understand the experiences that black women have faced in a society committed to universal liberty and equality. But then what they're also going to do is they're going to minimize the significance of property, right? And so they're minimizing the significance of property so that they can find an alternative source of autonomy for consent. And what ultimately it's going to be is that source of autonomy is going to be their relationships with each other. And the relationships that are going to be fundamentally based on a kind of commitment to care. So I'm just going to wrap it up really quick today because I'm looking at the time here. And when you write these out, it always takes a little bit longer than you expect. But I want to close today by urging you to consider that, to paraphrase the title of Eddie Glaude's most recent book, is that you are the leaders you have been looking for. And it is possible for you to have the ability to turn the page. But to do so, we really have to reclaim what consent is and to fully think about how we make our political decisions. And what is animating those political decisions? Are we making them out of fear of what might happen to us? Are we doing it in some sort of defensive capacity? Or are we actually making our decisions based on a kind of ethos of care? So this is Audre Lorde. And Audre Lorde is saying that, and trying to again articulate this African American feminist perspective, and making this argument that we have to be able to talk to each other to get beyond our fear of each other. We have to, at some extent, recognize that we have experiences that are in common. And I just don't think that I could have words that would say it as effectively as Audre Lorde does. That I might be contributing not only to each of their oppressions, but also to my own. And the anger which stands between us then must be used for clarity and mutual empowerment, not for evasion by guilt or for further separation. I am not free while any woman is unfree, even when her shackles are very different from my own. And I am not free as long as one person of color remains chained, nor is any of you. And what this is calling us to do is to recognize that in our civil society, we are not only just rights-bearing individuals competing with each other for resources, but instead our security, the foundation of our consent, requires the recognition of a fundamental interdependency and interconnectedness that all of us have with each other. Our lives always intersect. And it is at those intersections that we have the obligation to communicate with each other, to understand each other, and to understand how what benefits you also has a benefit for me in some direct way, because our lives are always, as Ellen Watkins Harper said, bound up together. Thank you.